Now let's bring in Sumedha Deshmukh. She worked on the World Economic Forum's Decentralized Finance Policy Toolkit. It helps governments understand the sector and what rules they can put in place. She joins us from San Francisco. Welcome to the show. Now let's start with the basics. What is DeFi and what are some of its most common uses?
Decentralized finance is a category of financial services that are built on top of blockchain technology. So they use a combination of things that we've seen before, including digital assets, blockchain protocol layers, smart contracts, to create a new system of financial services that is without intermediaries. So today, you can think of the way that we interact with financial services as being very dependent on these intermediaries, like banks, for example. With decentralized finance, all of the transactions are happening in a peer to peer and autonomous manner, all built on top of a blockchain transaction layer. And what we're seeing is a lot of financial services that we see today being replicated in this environment. So you'll see credit and lending, you'll see insurance, a number of different services that are based in this manner being built on top of blockchain. And what's interesting about decentralized finance is that because they're all based on this blockchain layer, they're what we call composable. So you can build these services on top of each other and extend them and create a system of what is known within the blockchain space of money Legos, of combining these services on that blockchain layer and creating potentially new services in the future.
And of course, a lot of people are very gung ho about the possibilities being endless here. But as you mentioned, no regulator essentially in the middle. And that's a risk for many people. What are some of the key risks that you guys were highlighting in this report?
Absolutely. And, I think as the World Economic Forum, what our goal is to create neutral, clear guidance around some of these very complex and emerging issues. And you're exactly right. New technology doesn't come without new risks. And our goal is how do we create resources that can mitigate some of these risks while accelerating some of the benefits. So, as you mentioned, one of the core components of the toolkit that was released today is a mapping framework. So, we divide the risks into 5 categories of the different types of risks that may be faced by consumers and that regulators and policymakers should be thinking about as it relates to decentralized finance. So some of these risks might be ones that we're familiar with, financial in nature, such as market risks, liquidity risks, etc. Some of them are going to be technical in nature, given that blockchain technology is relatively new. There are different components that may have vulnerabilities, such as smart contracts risks or minor risks. You also have operational risks. So we've kind of heard some of the stories of upgrades and the failures that we may have seen in key management of some individuals. Those are all things that are relatively new to blockchain technology. Then you have legal and regulatory risks, and that's a lot of what the toolkit focuses on. And finally, you have emergent risks. So what are new things that could happen as a result of the new capabilities of blockchain technology being involved in financial services? So, for example, this composability feature, which I mentioned earlier, means that you may have risks that come from combining these financial services that we may not have seen with the financial services as they stand alone.
So the
So,
unknown
we're hoping.
unknowns, you mean? So more on that, the initial reaction we saw from many governments was to just announce bans on cryptocurrencies. Is that even a viable alternative at this point?
Every government is taking a different approach, and we understand the instinct to want to protect your customers. As we're not going to be naive about the fact that there are risks involved with decentralized finance, risks involved with blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies. However, part of what this toolkit and our work hopes to enable is taking a approach that balances the risks that we see with some of the opportunities that we see. Um, you know, unknown unknowns apply to risks, but they also apply to benefits. And we don't really know how this industry can progress, how it can change some of the long held challenges that we've had with the financial system without offering the opportunity for innovation. So, part of what the toolkit hopes to offer is alternatives to outright bans while still keeping in mind that there are these various policy objectives and considerations that policymakers and regulators are weighing around the world. And the idea is not to be prescriptive. Every jurisdiction has its own considerations, its own set of issues and ideas within its ecosystem, but to really offer a sense of what's been done and what could be done as various approaches to policy and regulation in this quickly evolving and emerging space.
And yet, that being said, if we look at the global financial system, there are at least some minimum standards that are accepted globally, and that is how the world works, so to speak. So, do you think there will inevitably have to be more cooperation between countries, between central banks or other regulators that might have to be created, frankly, and may not even exist at this point, in order to get these systems to work?
Absolutely. And I think the nature of DeFi and blockchain technology is that it's borderless in many senses. In many instances, it's permissionless. So coordination is going to have to happen at some stage and in some form to ensure that some of these things are enforceable and consistent across jurisdictions. I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is a lack of regulatory clarity and a clear policy landscape for innovation like this to take place. And I think, as you mentioned, we've seen that in the financial system in the past, that this is something that has required coordination at the cross jurisdictional and international level. And I think we're already kind of starting to see some of this activity in the cryptocurrency space very early, I think, on decentralized finance, but really seeing some of these international bodies waking up to the reality that cryptocurrency, blockchain technology is kind of here to stay, and really figuring out how can we balance those potential risks with the potential for innovation and creating new services.
So, Miller, very quickly now, on the one hand, we see that there's a large number of people who are unbanked, and decentralized finance presents the opportunity to bring the banking system to those people. On the other hand, we have such lack of knowledge even among regulators. So we really seem to just be picking at the pebbles of this on the shores of this ocean, right, so to speak. How much time do you think it's going to take before people will see cryptocurrencies and blockchain beyond a way to make a quick buck on a market, perhaps, and actually use them in their everyday lives?
That is a good question. And if I had the exact answer, I think I could make a lot of money knowing the crystal ball. But I think we're starting to see, especially in the last year, a lot of growth in this space. In decentralized finance, especially, we saw a huge amount of growth in the past year. So I definitely think that the activity is picking up, and we'll continue to see a lot of activity over the next 5 to 10 years in developing this. Exactly as you said, I think there's a lot of work to still be done on the educational front, on the infrastructure front. There are a lot of prerequisites that need to happen realistically for this to take off and for it to reach a wider audience. And so I think that's a lot of the work that needs to be done and is being done today, not just with policymakers and regulators, but with the lay individuals who may be using this service and may not be familiar with it today. So, part of it was the toolkit for policymakers and regulators, but we also put out a paper earlier this year, last month, that was called DeFi Beyond the Hype, intended to demystify it for the average consumer. And I think there's a lot of work still to be done there that will be having to be done over the next, again, 5 to 10 years to really get that to the next level of users.
Fascinating, like a frontier of finance, let's say. Thank you so much, Sumedha Deshmukh, with her input there.